There's a 140-year-old house design from Australia that never needs air conditioning, floods cannot touch, termites cannot eat, and it was solving climate problems that American tiny house builders are still struggling with today. It is called the Queenslander, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this forgotten style might be the smartest tiny house blueprint on the planet in 2026. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell, because we're about to break down the full 2026 cost numbers for both Australia and the United States. The hidden design trick that makes this house cooler than anything with a compressor and the one regulatory loophole that could completely change how you build your next tiny home. Stick around, because the final section of this video covers a rule that catches almost every first-time builder off guard. And if you miss it, it could cost you your entire build. So what actually is a Queenslander? It is a style of house that emerged in Queensland, Australia in the mid-1800s, built by settlers who had one very specific problem: brutal subtropical heat, torrential seasonal rain, and a landscape crawling with termites. There was no air conditioning. There was no modern pest control. So builders came up with a structural solution instead of a technological one. They lifted the entire house off the ground on timber stumps, sometimes 2 or 3 feet high, sometimes 10 feet or more, depending on the slope of the land. This single decision solved almost every problem at once. Termites could not climb smooth, capped timber stumps to reach the floor joists. Floodwater and storm runoff could pass harmlessly underneath instead of pooling against a slab. And the gap under the house let air move freely beneath the floor, pulling heat away from the living space above. Then they added the second signature feature, the wraparound veranda. Wide, shaded, wrapping around 2, 3, sometimes all 4 sides of the house. The veranda did double duty. It kept direct sun off the walls and windows, which is the single biggest driver of indoor heat gain in a hot climate. It created an entire second living zone outdoors, which is exactly the kind of indoor-outdoor flow that modern tiny house design has been chasing for the last decade. Add in high-pitched gable roofs that let hot air rise and vent out above the ceiling line through a genuine stack effect, tall windows and doors positioned across from each other for cross-ventilation, and lightweight timber and corrugated iron construction that was cheap, fast to build, and easy to repair, and you have a house that was engineered for passive survival in a brutal climate almost a century before the word passive house existed. There's a reason this style survived for 140 years while dozens of other colonial house forms faded out. It was not built for looks first. It was built because it worked, and the look came later once people realized how good the elevated, shaded silhouette actually was. Here is why this old design is suddenly relevant again. Tiny homes in 2026 are still fighting the same 3 enemies the original Queenslander builders fought: heat, moisture, and pests. Except now, we are cramming all of that into 300 square feet or less, where every degree of temperature swing and every drop of trapped moisture matters even more because there is nowhere for it to dissipate. Elevating a house lets air circulate underneath it, which helps with passive cooling by pulling heat away from the floor. Wide verandas shade the walls and windows from direct sun, and large windows placed across from each other let breezes move straight through the home to carry heat out. On a tiny house, this is even more powerful because a small footprint means every wall is closer to the roof and the ground. So a design that manages heat at the perimeter and underneath the floor cools the entire structure far more efficiently than a same-size box sitting flat on a slab. There's also a practical build advantage nobody talks about. Elevating a tiny house on stumps or piers gives you a crawl space for your plumbing, your gray water lines, and your electrical runs, instead of burying them in a slab or cramming them into a wall cavity where a single leak becomes a nightmare to find and fix. That is a massive maintenance advantage for anyone planning to live in a tiny home for years, not months, because you can crawl under the house and inspect every line without cutting into a single wall. And then there is pest control, which almost nobody factors into their tiny house budget until it becomes a problem. A slab-mounted tiny home in a termite-prone region needs ongoing chemical treatment and regular inspection to protect the timber. An elevated Queenslander style build uses physical separation instead of chemical treatment. Capped stumps create a barrier termites simply cannot climb, which means lower long-term pest management costs stacked on top of the cooling savings. Let's talk about what this house is actually built from, because the materials matter just as much as the shape. Traditional Queenslanders use lightweight timber framing, timber cladding known as VJ or V-jointed boards on the interior walls, and corrugated iron roofing. Every one of those materials was chosen because it was light enough to sit on a stump foundation without needing the massive footings a brick or masonry home would require. For a modern tiny house build, that same lightweight timber and metal roofing combination is still the smart choice. And for one more reason beyond weight. Timber and metal are both easy to repair in sections. If a board splits or a roof sheet dents, you replace that one piece instead of tearing into an entire wall system the way you might with a more integrated modern building material. For anyone building a tiny home they plan to maintain themselves for the next 20 years, that repairability is worth more than it looks like on paper. The stumps themselves deserve their own mention. Traditional builds used timber stumps with metal ant caps, a small flared metal plate at the top of each stump that termites cannot climb over. Modern elevated tiny house builds often swap in engineered steel piers or concrete piers instead, which last longer, need zero termite treatment, and can be adjusted more easily if the ground shifts. If you're building new in 2026, steel or concrete piers with a proper footing are the more durable option over timber stumps, even though timber stumps are what give the traditional Queenslander its classic look. Now let us talk numbers, because this is where people either commit to a build or walk away. A custom tiny home in Australia in 2026 typically starts around $85,000, with most builds landing between $85,000 and $160,000 or more, depending on size, finishes, and inclusions. Entry-level builds sit at the low end of that range. Mid-tier homes with a proper kitchen, a real bathroom, and decent finishes land in the $120,000 to $160,000 zone. Fully off-grid setups with solar, water tanks, and composting systems push above that. A Queenslander-style build specifically will usually sit toward the higher end of any tiny house budget for one simple reason. The elevation itself is not free. Raising a structure on stumps requires extra materials and labor for the stump footings and the subfloor framing, and the decorative fretwork, balustrades, and wraparound verandas that define the look each add to the overall cost. You're not just building a box. You're building a box on a platform with a full perimeter porch, and that porch is square footage you're paying to frame, roof, and finish, even though nobody is going to put a bed in it. For context, if you're building in the United States instead of Australia, the average cost to build a tiny house in 2026 ranges from $35,000 to $95,000, depending on size, location, materials, and whether you self-build or hire a contractor, with the national median sitting around $60,000 to $70,000 for a fully finished home. Add the stump elevation and wraparound veranda that make a Queenslander, and you should budget 15 to 25% above whatever a flat, slab-mounted tiny house of the same interior square footage would cost you. That premium buys you flood protection, pest protection, and a passive cooling system that never needs a filter change or a service call. Here is a simple way to think about where that 15 to 25% actually goes. Stump or pier footings and subfloor framing account for a meaningful chunk of it on their own, since you are essentially building a second, smaller structure just to hold the first one up off the ground. The veranda decking, roofing, and railing add another slice, since a wraparound porch on a tiny house can easily add 50 to 100 square feet of covered space you still have to frame and finish. And any decorative fretwork or ornate balustrade detailing, the kind that makes a Queenslander instantly recognizable in photos, sits on top of that as a pure aesthetic cost you can scale up or down depending on how traditional you want the final look to be. Here is where things get interesting, and where most tiny house content completely drops the ball, because the rules genuinely depend on one single factor: whether the home has wheels or a permanent foundation. Under Queensland law, a caravan, which includes a tiny house on wheels, can be placed on private land without a building permit, and what councils actually regulate is whether you're allowed to live in it permanently, with that answer varying by local council area across the state. That is the so-called caravan loophole. It gets you onto the land fast, but permanent occupancy is still a conversation you need to have with your specific council before you move in for good. Build the exact same Queenslander design on a fixed foundation instead of a trailer, and the legal picture changes completely. A tiny home built on a permanent foundation is classified as a Class 1A building under the National Construction Code, which means it has to comply with the full set of standard building regulations, including energy efficiency requirements, setbacks, and the normal council approval process. And here is a 2026 update that is a genuinely big deal if you are planning a fixed foundation build. Following state-level reforms that remove the old family-only occupancy restrictions on secondary dwellings, local council planning schemes across Queensland now allow permanent secondary dwellings ranging from 80 square meters up to 100 square meters or more, particularly on larger or rural lots, without requiring a full planning development application. That threshold is far more generous than most other Australian states allow, and it directly benefits anyone planning a Queenslander-style secondary dwelling in their own backyard. Compare that to Victoria, where small second dwellings are capped at 60 square meters on lots of at least 300 square meters statewide, with no path around that cap the way Queensland offers one. If you're choosing between states to build a Queenslander-style tiny home in Australia in 2026, Queensland is currently one of the friendliest regulatory environments in the entire country to do it in, and that flexibility is a genuine competitive advantage for builders and buyers alike. Now here is the part one promise you at the start of this video, the rule that catches almost every first-time builder off guard, and it has nothing to do with permits or square footage. It has to do with what happens the moment you plug your tiny house into the grid. If you hard plumb a mobile tiny home directly into a permanent on-site water or sewer connection, that single action strips away its movable dwelling status entirely and immediately triggers a full formal approval process under the National Construction Code. Read that again. The thing that makes a tiny house on wheels legally simple, its classification as a caravan, disappears the second you connect it the same way you would connect a permanent house. Once that hard connection is made, councils reclassify the structure as a fixed Class 1A permanent building, which brings the full weight of standard building codes, energy efficiency ratings, and mandatory approvals down on a home that was supposed to stay in the simple, lightly regulated caravan category. Builders spend months navigating the caravan loophole, get their home placed on the land with zero building permit required, and then undo all of that convenience in one afternoon by running a permanent water line to the kitchen sink instead of using a flexible hose connection or a tank and pump system. This is exactly the kind of detail that separates a smooth, tiny house build from a 6-month fight with your local council. And it is the single most common mistake we see people make with elevated, wired and tiny homes like the Queenslander, because the whole appeal of the design is that it feels permanent. It has stumps. It has a veranda. It looks like a real house. So people treat the utilities like a real house too, and that is exactly the moment the legal classification flips on them. If you want to keep your Queenslander-style build in the caravan category for as long as possible, the safer approach is a flexible potable water hose connection, a holding tank for gray water and black water, and a plug-in style power connection rather than a hardwired electrical tie-in. The moment any one of those three systems becomes permanent and fixed, assume your legal classification is about to change with it. So should you actually build a Queenslander-style tiny house in 2026? If you live somewhere hot, humid, or prone to flooding, this design solves real physical problems that most tiny house styles do not even attempt to address. The elevation protects your floor system from water and pests without a single mechanical part. The veranda gives you genuine outdoor living space that effectively doubles your usable square footage without doubling your climate control costs. And the passive cross ventilation means lower energy bills for the entire life of the home. The trade-off is cost and complexity. You're paying for stump footings, subfloor framing, and veranda construction that a flat, slab-mounted tiny house simply does not need. And if you're going the fixed foundation route, you're working within full Class 1A building code compliance, not the lighter touch rules that apply to something on wheels. If you're in a cold, dry climate with no flood risk and no significant termite pressure, a lot of what makes the Queenslander special stops paying for itself. The elevations still give you a useful crawl space for utilities, but you lose most of the passive cooling benefit if your real problem is keeping heat in rather than pushing it out, and you're still paying the same stump and veranda premium either way. If your climate genuinely calls for it, though, the math works in your favor over the long run, because you are trading a higher upfront build cost for a house that essentially air conditions and pest-proofs itself using nothing but its own shape. That is a rare thing to find in any tiny house design in 2026, and it is exactly why this 140-year-old style is still worth building today. That is the Queenslander, a 140-year-old design that might be exactly what the modern tiny house movement has been missing. If this video helped you picture your own build, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Drop a comment and tell me whether you would go with a wheel build or a fixed foundation for a design like this. And give this video a thumbs up if you want more deep dives into regional house styles that actually solve real climate problems instead of just looking good in a thumbnail. I will see you in the next one.